Individuals who've been diagnosed as psychopaths generally display a disregard for the feelings and well-beings of others, and in some rare cases they end up committing heinous crimes that the rest of the world finds hard to fathom. But this is not always the case, as some psychopaths manage to control their condition and go on to live normal lives. Number 10. Belle Gunness was born in Norway in 1859. She was the youngest of 8 children, and having grown up on a farm, she became physically very strong. She became pregnant for the first time when she was 18 years old, but lost her child when a man attacked her while she was attending a dance. Many people have speculated that this, along with the fact that her attacker was never prosecuted, contributed to her heinous crimes that she went on to commit later in life. When she turned 22, she moved to the US and settled in Chicago, where she changed her name and found a job as a servant. It was a role that she was very familiar with, since she'd worked as a servant in Norway for several years. 3 years later, she met a man called Mads Albert Sorensen. The pair fell in love and got married before starting a business, a candy store together. This proved to be a bad decision, as the store failed to make much money, and inexplicably it burned down along with their house. When they received the insurance payout, they were able to buy a new house, where they went on to have 4 children, though 2 failed to live past their infancy. Some sources state that they also adopted a girl named Jenny Olsen. Albert had taken out 2 life insurance policies, and strangely, he lost his life on the very day that the 2 policies overlapped. At first, it was suspected that he'd been poisoned with strychnine, but a second doctor declared that he'd passed away from an enlarged heart. Belle collected the insurance money and then purchased a farm in La Porta in Indiana. Once there, another mysterious fire broke out, and both the boathouse and carriage house were destroyed, but this happened before her arrival. Just as she was about to set off for Indiana, she met a man named Peter Gunness, a butcher who also came from Norway. They got married in 1902, but in December of that same year, he lost his life when, by Belle's account, a sausage-making machine fell from a shelf in their kitchen and hit him on top of his head. But her children started telling their friends that Belle had murdered Peter with a meat cleaver. Belle convinced investigators that it was nothing more than an accident, and she was never charged. She once again collected the insurance money, and an inquest was held, but no charges were filed. She then started placing ads in the newspaper, stating she was looking for a husband, and many men replied. She started dressing up whenever she met with her suitors, one of whom was John Moe, who would mysteriously disappear a week later. His $1,000 that he had with him was never found. She then started seeing George Anderson, who promised to pay off her mortgage as soon as they got married. But he fled from her house out of fear that she would end his life, after he woke up one night to find her standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him with a psychopathic expression on her face that sent shivers down his spine. He was never seen in that area again. Many more suitors traveled to the farm, but none were ever seen again. This included Ole Budsberg and Andrew Hegelian. By now, Belle had started collecting trunks that were hidden throughout the house, and she became somewhat reclusive. She then hired a man named Joe Maxton, who barely escaped from a fire that broke out in the house. When the authorities arrived, they found the remains of 4 people inside, and Lemvier, her first farmhand, was arrested, since Belle claimed he'd threatened to burn her house down. It was believed that Belle had succumbed in the blaze, but the woman who was found was much shorter. Nevertheless, it was ruled that Belle had passed away. In the ruins, the police found 8 men's watches and the remains of Andrew Hegelian. This prompted further searches, and several more bodies were found, most of which remain unidentified. Lemvier was eventually acquitted, but he passed away in prison after being found guilty of arson. Before this, though, he told a priest that he had helped Belle bury many of her victims, and the woman found in the house came from Chicago and was lured to the house with a promise of work. She set fire to the house before fleeing. Belle supposedly set fire to the house before fleeing. She'd collected as much as $250,000 from her victims. She was reportedly spotted all over the country in the years that followed, but she was never captured and likely lived out the rest of her life in luxury. Number 9. In May of 2009, the police in Milwaukee started to speculate that a serial killer may be operating in the area. 7 months earlier, the bodies of 2 women, Deborah Harris and Tanya Miller, were discovered in a river and a house's garage, respectively. But at first, the 2 cases were not thought to be linked. It's believed that for the next 9 years, the culprit lay low until April of 1995, when another woman, Florence McCormick, was found deceased in the basement of an empty house while repairs were being done on the building. In June and August of that year, 2 more women were discovered after their lives were ended. The first was Sheila Ferrier, who was also found in a house that was being remodeled. Jessica Payne was found behind an empty house and would later be confirmed that she had traveled to the area from South Milwaukee. 2 years later, on the 20th of June, Joyce Mims was found deceased on the 2nd floor of an empty house after workers entered the property to start renovations. Her family stated she'd gone missing 2 days earlier. 10 years then passed before the next victim was found. On the 27th of April 2007, a building inspector accompanied 2 people to an empty house and upon entering, found the remains of Otherian Stokes. It was obvious that she too had been attacked. By 2009, it was suspected that the same person had carried out these attacks, and an investigation into the possibility of a psychopathic serial killer being responsible was started. Investigators started looking at reports of other crimes in the area and found that one name, Walter E. Ellis, kept appearing over and over again. They decided to take a closer look at his life and soon started suspecting that he was the one who committed these crimes. They'd collected DNA from all the crime scenes and could only prove their suspicions if they were able to collect Ellis's for comparison. They managed to find out where he lived, and upon searching the property, they gathered DNA from his toothbrush. When it was analyzed, it was confirmed that his DNA was present in each of their cases, and he was taken into custody. When all was said and done, it was determined that Ellis had ended the lives of 9 women over the span of 21 years, and it's suspected that he may have ended the lives of 20 more. But people started asking why it took so long for Ellis to be caught, since many women would have escaped his fate had he been identified earlier. It was then revealed that since all the victims were street workers, their cases were seen as low priority and never fully investigated. Furthermore, it was discovered that Ellis had been arrested once before in 2001 for an unrelated crime, and his DNA was collected, but it was then misplaced and never entered into the National DNA database. Initially, Ellis pleaded not guilty, but later changed to guilty following a plea deal. No trial was held as a result, and Ellis was sentenced to 7 life sentences. Number 8. Robert Lytton, the 1st Earl of Lytton and Viceroy of India from 1876 to 1880, is considered by many to have had psychopathic tendencies, thanks to his handling of the Second Anglo-Afghan War and the events that transpired after the fact. In 1876, crops in Indiana started to deteriorate when the rains that the country depends on during the monsoon season failed to arrive. Thus started the Great Famine, also known as the Madras Famine, as food prices became unaffordable for the average citizen. At the time, Madras was still under British rule, and hence a large portion of India was affected, as more than 31 million people lived in that region. Furthermore, Madras was responsible for supplying much of the country with grains such as rice and wheat, and other regions were also severely affected. As was expected, the population grew ever more desperate, and on several occasions, people had to be arrested when they stormed grain storage facilities in hopes of finding some food to feed their families. Hyderabad, Bombay, and other areas were in dire need of aid as people were starving, but were receiving no help. Soon, diseases such as cholera and malaria started to spread, and many lives were lost. To make matters worse, crops that had once been used to sustain the local people were now being used by the British to turn a profit, and most of the food that was grown was exported to other countries, including England. Littleton, when faced with this issue, argued that nothing could be done since he felt that free trade was far more important. He added that he was certain that food would eventually arrive in India as long as private enterprise was allowed to continue. This in itself was a weak argument, but coupled with the fact that the British government kept increasing taxes, it made the situation far more desperate than it should have been. Farmers no longer cared to till their lands, since the food that was grown was taken away, and once this was done, they also needed to pay taxes. It came as no surprise then that in 1979, 3 years into Lytton's tenure as viceroy, someone attempted to end his life with a firearm while he was traveling to Government House, but his would-be assassin was unsuccessful. Thanks to the inaction of the British government and the outrageous claims made by Lytton, as many as 10,000 people lost their lives to the famine and the diseases that accompanied it. This caused outrage around the world, but India remained under British control until 1947. Number 7. Usually, when psychopaths are discussed, we think of individuals who have no regard for the lives or feelings of others, and who struggle to understand basic human emotions. But in one case from the 1870s, the entire family exhibited these traits, and they remain as infamous today as the day that they were captured for their horrific crimes. The Bender family was made up of John Bender, known as Pa, Ma Bender, whose real name isn't known, as well as Kate Bender and John Gebert. In 1870, they were living in Labette County, Kansas, where they owned and ran a roadside inn along the Osage Trail. Weary travelers would often stop there for a night to rest and find something to eat. While this may sound ideal, the inn was actually just a 12 by 16-foot cabin that couldn't accommodate many people. Nevertheless, the family hatched a plan whereby they would rob their visitors and end their lives before disposing of their remains. Kate, who claimed to be a spiritualist, would distract their visitor, while unbeknownst to their victims, one of the other family members would remain hidden, armed with a hammer. Once the opportunity presented itself, they would jump out from cover and attack the traveler, and once they were deceased, they'd be robbed. Soon, many people were being reported as missing in the area, but not much was done about it. That is, until a physician named Dr. York inexplicably disappeared one night, and his brother, who was a senator, demanded a thorough investigation. When the Benders' property was searched, the truth finally came to light as 8 men were found buried after being stripped of their possessions. Further searches uncovered 3 more bodies in other areas, and these are also attributed to the Benders. A search was started to track the family down, and at one point, 2 women named Almira Monroe and Sarah Davis were accused of being part of the Benders. But since the police didn't have any photos of the family, they were unable to prove their suspicions, and they were set free. A lawyer was able to provide proof that one of the women was in prison when the crimes were committed, and the other was pregnant at the time, and hence was thought to have been unable to aid in such crimes. The Benders' cabin became somewhat of a tourist attraction, as people traveled from all over the country to catch a glimpse of the building where the crimes were committed. Some even stole items from the house as souvenirs, while victims were still being recovered from the grounds. It's believed that the family then fled to Texas, where they hid out in hopes that the investigation would blow over. They were never seen or heard from again, and many theories as to what happened to them have been suggested. Some believe that since Texas was a violent area back then, they may have met their end while relocating there. Others think that Kate and John likely fled to Colorado, where they continued to commit similar crimes, but this has never been proven. Number 6. In 1874, Marietta Ball was working in St. Albans, Vermont as a school teacher. On the 24th of July that year, she'd finished work for the day, and at around 3:30 p.m. started to head home to Mrs. Abel's boarding house. But she decided to walk through a wooded area to see a friend, Foster Page, with whom she'd on occasion spent the weekend visiting. Those living at the boarding house knew about this habit, and hence no one thought anything about the fact that she didn't return that night. When she failed to arrive at Foster's home, he also didn't become concerned, as he assumed she'd returned to the boarding house. But when he asked after her the next morning, it was determined she'd gone missing while walking home, and a search was organized. The search party concentrated on the path she usually took to Foster's house, and soon enough they found Marietta deceased along that very path. She had been badly beaten by an attacker, and as soon as news of the tragedy broke, a $3,000 reward was offered to anyone who could provide the police with information, leading to her attacker's arrest. The attack sent the town into a frenzy, but it wasn't the only heinous crime that had been committed in the area. A man who'd been heading back to Canada from Massachusetts had passed through the town when he was confronted by two unidentified men who ended his life with a sharpened blade. Unfortunately, no one came forward with any information on Marietta's case, and it seems as though the culprit would get away with their crime. A few months later, the reward for information was doubled to $6,000, which was a massive amount of money back in the day. After a while, residents of the town started to suspect that George Gregory Smith, the son of a senator and governor, might be the attacker, but they had no proof. He was only suspected because he was the only one with connections powerful enough to cover up the crime. But as soon as these rumors started to spread, more information came to light. It was revealed that at some point, Smith and Marietta had attended the same dance, and for reasons unknown, they'd gotten into an argument, during which he hurled insults at her. But he had also visited her in her room at the boarding house. On the night that she went missing, someone saw a horse and carriage, believed to be Smith's, near the spot where Marietta was found. When Smith found out about these rumors, he proclaimed his innocence to the point where he demanded that a hearing be held. Witnesses stated that the altercation at the dance never happened, since Smith wasn't there that night, and others claimed he had never been inside the boarding house at all. The witness who described his carriage near the crime scene suddenly made a U-turn and stated they couldn't be certain that it was Smith's. The case stagnated once more, and it would likely have remained a mystery were it not for another crime that was committed. On the 4th of October, 1875, the remains of Josie Langmaid were discovered, also in a wooded area, but this time in Pembroke, New Hampshire. The scene was strikingly similar to Marietta's, and when detectives realized that a man who'd been questioned in her case was living in Pembroke, they hauled him in for questioning. When his house was searched, biological material was found along with an axe. He was put on trial, where his sordid history of stalking and attacking women was revealed. He was found guilty in 1978 and was executed, bringing his reign of terror to a much-needed close. Number 5. There's no doubt that life was very different in the 1800s, as is evidenced by the case concerning a serial killer named Minnie Wallace, who later became Minnie Walkup. She met her first husband when she was 15 years old. James Walkup was the mayor of Emporia in Kansas, and on one occasion when he was living in New Orleans, he met Minnie at the World's Fair while staying at Minnie's mother's boarding house. He became enthralled with her musicianship, and soon enough the pair fell in love. He eventually traveled back to Kansas, but he and Minnie stayed in touch by writing to each other for some time. When he returned to New Orleans later on, he proposed, and realizing he was a rich man who would look after her family, Minnie accepted. She relocated to Kansas, and there she and Walkup tied the knot. But just a month later, he was found deceased, and a coroner ruled that his life had been ended via arsenic poisoning. It was discovered that Minnie had bought small amounts of poison in the weeks after the wedding, and that she'd also purchased a large dose of strychnine from a chemist. When the chemist's documents were checked, it was found that she'd filled in the required form for such substances, but left the portion of the page where she was supposed to state the purpose blank. Walkup's doctor stated that he'd been treated for symptoms similar to strychnine poisoning, but after receiving treatment, he recovered. But he soon returned to the doctor's office, and this time he showed signs of arsenic poisoning. Minnie was arrested and placed on trial, to the delight of the media. But it then came to light that Walkup was in the habit of ingesting arsenic tablets, and that he likely accidentally had taken too much. When the trial was done, Minnie was acquitted, and she walked out of the courtroom a free woman. She received a large inheritance and then left Kansas for Chicago, and here she met a man named Jack Ketchum, and started a relationship, and it would later be revealed that they'd gotten married in secret. Quite unbelievably, Jack, who was an alcoholic, was found deceased a month after their wedding, and it was determined that he too had been poisoned. She then revealed that they'd gotten married, and she was suspected for a while, but never charged. Minnie then met Delancey Louderback, the owner of a railroad, who was known to have brought her many gifts, though they never married. He gifted Minnie with a massive house, but he never visited her there since she had no romantic feelings towards him. She made this clear by informing him that she was relocating to Europe to be with her new fiancé. While this would have put most suitors off, Louderback still included her in his will, and shortly after, he was found deceased, a victim of cyanide poisoning. It was never determined whether Minnie was responsible for ending his life, as some people claim that she'd already left for Europe by that time, but it's almost certain that she did end the lives of her two husbands, and that she did so thanks to her psychopathic tendencies. Number 4. Jack the Ripper, probably the most famous serial killer to ever live, committed his crimes in Whitechapel, London, England, between August and November of 1888. The crimes made news worldwide, and so when 2 murders rocked San Francisco in 1895, people immediately started comparing the cases to those in Whitechapel, since they were also very gruesome. Most people believed that whoever committed the crimes must have been suffering from a mental issue such as psychopathy, as was suspected of Jack the Ripper. The difference between these 2 cases was that the culprit in San Francisco was eventually caught, whereas Jack the Ripper was never identified. Theodore Durant, known to some as William, showed worrying signs of mental illness from a young age. As a kid, he often became depressed and was eventually diagnosed as being manic depressive. He did his best to deal with the conditions given the state of medical care at the time, and as an adult started attending the Emmanuel Baptist Church, which was located in the Mission. But here, his true nature came to the fore, as several women started complaining that he'd made inappropriate comments towards them while they were visiting the church. Then, on the 3rd of April that year, things came to a head. At around 2 a.m., a 20-year-old woman named Blanche Lamont ran into Durant at the city's electric trolley stop on Polk Street. She knew him from the church, and according to other parishioners, they may have been dating. Witnesses saw her and Durant sitting next to each other on the trolley, looking very much in love. They exited the trolley on 21st Street, and they were then seen walking into the church together. Later that afternoon, the church organist unexpectedly met Durant on a set of stairs leading to the belfry, and he would later report that the man was pale and looked as though he was in some kind of distress. Durant explained that he had found a gas leak and had almost been overcome by the fumes while trying to fix it. The following morning, the area was abuzz when it was reported that Blanche had gone missing, and Durant speculated that she may have decided to become a street worker elsewhere. 9 days later, Durant was seen walking towards the church with another woman, Minnie Williams. Witnesses would state that they saw the pair arguing outside the building at around 8 p.m., and that he eventually guided her back into the church. He then attended a meeting at the church elder's home an hour later, but the next morning, ladies from the congregation were preparing for the church's Easter service when they made a gruesome discovery. One woman had been asked to get more prayer books from a closet, and when she opened it, Minnie's body was inside. When investigators arrived, they searched the church, and in the belfry, they found Blanche, also deceased. Since both women were last seen in Durant's company, he was immediately arrested. His trial made headlines across the country, and he was repeatedly compared to Jack the Ripper due to the nature of the attacks. Durant was dubbed the Demon of the Belfry, and after he was found guilty in 1898, he was executed at San Quentin. He never admitted to the crimes, and while speaking his last words, blamed the media for his incarceration and eventual execution. Number 3. When discussing serial killers, South Africa isn't a country that's often mentioned, but not many people know that the country has seen its fair share of these types of crimes over the centuries, one of whom was a man named Casper Krueger. Krueger was, by all accounts, a crafty man, as is evidenced by the fact that he was being held at a police station in Pinetown in KwaZulu-Natal in 2006, but somehow managed to conceal his true name and was booked under the name Jacques Duplessis. He'd been arrested after committing a hijacking in the city, but while in custody, he was already hatching a plan to escape. When he was arrested, his fingerprints were taken and sent for analysis, but this process took up to 8 weeks to complete at the time, and so his true identity remained unknown. On the 9th of April that year, Krueger received a parcel from a woman who was believed to be his girlfriend. It was assumed it contained nothing more than a few snacks, and so it was delivered to him. But when it was reported that the same woman had repeatedly been seen with two suspicious men in a silver car, it was decided that his cell should be searched. 4 officers entered the cell, but were caught unaware when he suddenly produced a firearm. He fired and wounded 2 of the officers, and a hostage situation started to unfold. Eventually, sharpshooters were called in, and seizing a rare opportunity, one of them managed to fire at Krueger and end his life. But it was only then that the true story started to unfold. In the weeks that followed, Krueger's true identity was discovered, and his heinous crimes were revealed. He and 2 other men had been involved in a series of attacks against 3 men in Johannesburg. After ending their lives, they stole their money and used it to buy alcohol and pay for street workers. One of the men testified against his accomplices, and Krueger was sentenced to be executed, though that sentence was eventually reduced to life in prison. While awaiting trial, though, someone smuggled a blade into the holding cell, and he successfully used it to saw through the cell's bars before escaping. When he was apprehended, he was handed a further 8 years behind bars, but while incarcerated, he complained he was feeling ill, and he was transferred to a clinic from where he and another inmate managed to escape. He then kidnapped a woman, who he tied up and placed in his car's trunk, but she managed to undo her bonds and escaped. She contacted the authorities, and it was then that he was arrested for hijacking a car. At his bail hearing, the magistrate was perplexed about his identity, and the matter was postponed. Following this, the weapon was smuggled into the Pinetown holding cells, where the final drama of his life unfolded. It was never determined who smuggled the weapon past the police that day, but many feel that if Krueger managed to escape that day, he would have gone on to commit many similar crimes thanks to his psychopathic nature. Number 2. Volker Eckert is considered to be one of the worst serial killers to have ever operated in Germany. He started showing worrying signs of psychotic behavior from an early age, as young as 14. It would come to light decades later that it was at this age in 1974 that he committed his first murder, but managed to avoid suspicion. 4 years later, at the age of 18, he was arrested when he assaulted and attempted to strangle a person who's not been named. He would later confess that during this time, he'd also committed several other crimes, most of which were against women. He spent less than 12 months in prison on that occasion before being released. Interestingly, he'd been arrested when he was 13 years old after he stole his mother's car to run away from home. During that incident, he led the police on a high-speed chase before being apprehended, and he was sentenced to 18 months behind bars. He stated that he was upset about the fact that his parents were considering getting divorced, and so he decided to run away. As an adult, he started working as a truck driver. Many people believe he chose this profession so that he could carry out the unthinkable crimes he then committed in Germany, Spain, and France over the course of 3 decades. In 1987, he was arrested again after he assaulted 2 women, and he was sentenced to 12 years, but was released after just 6. Then in 2006, 20-year-old Miglena Rahim was found deceased in Spain, and unbeknownst to Eckert, his time as a serial killer was about to come to an abrupt end. CCTV security footage showed his truck parked near the soccer stadium where Miglena was found, and investigators traveled to Spain where Eckert was questioned. At first, he denied any involvement, and during questioning complained that he was getting a migraine. He asked one of the officers to get his migraine medication from his truck, and what was found inside sealed his fate. The officer discovered photos of his victims, including Miglena, as well as lengths of rope that had writings about the crimes he had committed. He then confessed and started revealing the true scope of his crimes, since he expressed relief at finally being apprehended. He stated that he targeted street workers all over Europe, but only those who were illegal immigrants. During this session of questioning, he admitted to ending the lives of 5 women, and he was arrested. The arduous task of figuring out whether Eckert was involved in any other similar crimes then began. A group of officers started dissecting his life by scouring through his work documents and other records, such as credit card transactions, gas receipts, toll road payments, and satellite traffic information from the company that he worked for. This allowed them to paint a clear picture of his whereabouts while working as a truck driver. and before long it was determined that he was responsible for ending the lives of at least 7 more women. It was also found that he had assaulted as many as 40 women over the course of several decades, but his confessions ended there when he learned he was being called a monster by the media. He decided only to speak to his attorney while awaiting trial, but he never faced true justice as he lost his life while incarcerated in 2007. Number 1. Antoinette Scier's true psychopathic nature was revealed not only by the crimes she committed, but also by her reaction upon learning she was to be executed in April of 1926. Few details are known about Scier's childhood, though it's known she was born in Italy and eventually relocated to France. It was here that she started committing her first crimes. Instead of caring for the wounded, as she'd moved there to do, she would pilfer their belongings and despicably would write letters to their families requesting money, which she would then keep for herself. She was eventually arrested in 1915 after she was caught in possession of a war officer's paybook, but she only spent a short time in prison, and she then met a soldier named Salmon who hailed from Italy, and they decided to get married. They had 2 children together, but when Salmon found out she'd been having affairs behind his back, he ended the relationship. She then started dating Joseph Rosenal, an abusive alcoholic with whom she had another child before they moved to St. Gilles. She then started advertising her services as a carer for the elderly, and before long, several of her patients inexplicably lost their lives. These included a 58-year-old woman named Durant and another named Madame Lachapelle. In the latter case, it was suspected that Lachapelle had been poisoned, since she was seen convulsing before she passed away. Her husband also lost his life 2 days later, and Scier ruled the cause to be a heart attack. This was confirmed by another doctor, and the matter wasn't investigated any further. Shortly after this incident, Rosenal got drunk again one night and started assaulting Scier, as he'd done on many occasions before. But this time would be different, as he passed away that same night after eating a bowl of mussels that was served to him by his wife. She would later state that she relished watching him pass away, and that she went on to celebrate. Next, she claimed the life of 67-year-old Marie Martin, who was in Scier's care along with her sister, Madame Doyer. She'd served them coffee, which Doyer found too bitter, and she poured hers down the sink, but Marie drank hers and passed away that same night. At the time, she was also caring for another woman who was in her 70s. Soon after becoming Scier's patient, her health started to decline, and when she was found deceased, her room was searched. Under her bed, a bottle of ether mixed with herbicide was discovered, and at last Scier was suspected. Several people came forward to accuse her of being a serial killer, and the remains of her deceased husband, as well as those of several of her patients, were exhumed. It was determined they'd all been poisoned using the same substance found in the bottle, and Scier was arrested. While she confessed to her crimes, she stated that her neighbor was an accomplice, but they were eventually cleared of any suspicion. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.